Welcome everyone to this Tea with a SME session on building industry and higher education and engagement for economic growth. My name is Mir Tila and I'm USAID Philippines Senior Education Advisor. I'm happy to be here with you today, and we are recording this session and it will be posted later to education links. I'm going to make sure you're all comfortable navigating and using the various features of this Google Meet, and I'll outline the agenda for today, and then we will all dive into the presentation. To start us off, I ask that you make sure your microphones are muted and your web cameras are turned off. If you're not familiar with Google Meet, you can do this by moving your mouse to the bottom of the screen. A little white menu bar will appear, and you can click the microphone and webcam buttons to enable or disable them. You can also turn on the automatic captions feature as well if you'd like. I'll give you a few seconds right now to make sure you are muted and your webcams are turned off. Thank you. This is going to help the platform run more smoothly and reduce any unnecessary distractions. And when it's time for Q&A, I'll invite people to turn on their webcam to ask their questions if they so choose. Secondly, everyone will be using the chat window to notify us of any questions or comments that you may have as we introduce our topic and afterwards during the Q&A. Hi, Mitch. Sam Alvis will be monitoring the chat and noting your questions. So I invite you all now to go to the right-hand side, the top right-hand side of your screen, and click on the chat bubble icon, which will open up the chat window along the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, once you've done that, I'd like you all to answer the question, from where in the world are you joining us today? And to type your response in the chat window. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Hello, Guatemala, Maryland, from Jordan, Boston, Nigeria, Manila, of course, West Bank, Gaza, North Virginia, Wisconsin, Philippines, Mali, UK, DC, Indonesia. Wow. So that's a pretty good spread. So good evening to all of you who are in the part of the world where I'm in, and good afternoon to the others, and good morning to our friends in the US. So thanks everyone. So if at any point during our Google Meet today you experience any technical difficulties, please contact Nicole Douglas at jdouglas@umass.edu. So the presentation is around 15 minutes, and we're going to set up the majority of the time for the question and answers. And I'll start off by providing the development context, and then talk about the design, the implementation of the program, as well as lessons learned. So without further ado, let's dive in, and feel free to type questions and comments in the chat box as we go. All right. Next slide, please. So the Philippines, USAID Philippines re-entry into the higher education space really began in 2010. There was a new Philippine government with a new Philippine development plan, new mission management. Our office director at the time was Robert Birch, our deputy was Lee Marshall, and our mission director, the very dynamic Gloria Steele, who eventually became the assistant administrator for Asia. And she was actually one of the drivers of our higher education programming. She was a big believer in higher education, and she advocated and fought hard to get us funding for higher education. And there was a new White House initiative called the Partnership for Growth, which was basically a development program focused on just 4 countries globally, and the Philippines was the only country in Asia to be part of PFG. And this would focus on inclusive economic growth. So as they said during the time, the stars aligned, and in order to contribute to human capital development, we were going to do programming in higher education. So this marked the re-entry of the Philippines into higher ed. And we were the only donor at the time to make investments in higher education. Everyone else was focused on basic education. And before this time frame, the Philippine mission was 100% basic education, 100% in conflict-affected areas. So this was a pretty big pivot for us. It was uncharted territory, and we were entering a very complex subsector that had more than 2,000 institutions and millions of students enrolled. Next slide, please. So we took a look at the studies, we talked to key stakeholders, and we looked at the performance metrics. So the table here shows you the Philippines' performance in the Global Innovation Index a year before we started our program. And it looks pretty bad. We were at the bottom third, so overall 95 out of 141 countries. And if you take a look at human capital development indicators, it's really, really pretty bad. And World Bank, Asian Development Bank, even USAID's own constraints analysis showed that there was indeed a problem. But what was to us surprising, or maybe not so surprising, was that the problems in higher education were directly creating problems for innovation, and it was creating a very weak innovation ecosystem, and therefore had negative impact on high value sectors such as manufacturing. That's why we decided that our flagship program in higher education would be focused on achieving innovation outcomes. Next slide, please. So during program design of the flagship, actually Gloria, our mission director, encouraged us not to prescribe what we were what implementing partners were supposed to do, but simply to define the problem. So we defined the problem, and we defined our end state, and bidders came to us with their proposed solutions. And RTI International came up with the most compelling proposal of them all. And together with the University of Michigan, William Davidson Institute, Florida State, Rutgers, and Philippine Business for Education, they came up with a very great proposal for what would become the Science, Technology, Research, and Innovation for Development, or the STRIDE program. Well, that acronym is mine. I want to take credit for that. That's not RTI's. So it was a $31 million program, and it had 3 missions, the first of which was really industry and private sector engagement. But it also was working in parallel with 2 local global development alliances, the first of which was the partnership with the Philippine Business for Education. This is very important because it was actually our first entry into the higher ed space, and was responsible also for opening up a lot of doors for our industry academe linkage work. So next slide, please. Now, to dig deeper into the reasons why the innovation ecosystem was the way it was, RTI conducted the Philippine Innovation Ecosystem Assessment a year into the program. And the link has been shared, and you can access the study on the STRIDE website as well. And as you can see, well, the empty circles are the weakest factors, and the filled out circles are the strongest factors. But if you can see, those that directly pertain to industry academe collaboration, particularly the last one, which is the cross-cutting one on collaboration and trust and knowledge sharing, are very, very weak. And you know, it's very important to understand that we knew about this. This has been talked about for decades, but we didn't really know why. So the ecosystem assessment actually provided us with very, very good information and inputs into how to program STRIDE moving forward. Next slide, please. So STRIDE had a suite of activities, and it's a lot. This is just on mission 1. The first, well, those in red are the things that we were doing. It didn't really take off. Those in black were successful, but nevertheless were not sustained. And those in blue are the things that I'll be talking about, because these are some of our success stories and have been sustained even till today. So a cross-cutting thing about all of the things that we were doing is that every single thing that we did with universities required commitment on their part. They needed to put skin in the game, and we had actually required counterpart. And every time we would put out a call for whether it's a career center or something, it would always be in the form of an expression of interest, meaning it wasn't free money, it wasn't free interventions. We were there to work with them, to help them along their development journey, and not to provide them with freebies, right? It was really capacity building and building up their own networks, building up their own technology and know-how. Next slide, please. So I'll start with the Professional Science Master's Program, the PSM, which is a very innovative program introduced by Stride and RTI to the Philippines. And this addresses the perennial complaint of the curriculum relevance to industry. And also, to a great extent, the fact that universities and academia did not really speak the language of industry, so sort of the soft skills that were missing. And so the PSM is a curriculum, we describe it as an MBA for scientists or researchers. And it's co-developed with industry, and students are required to complete a capstone project that's industry-based. And so Stride played a role of a broker between the universities and industries. You know, universities had their own ideas of what they wanted to do, but oftentimes they did not really have the industry partner or the right industry partner to be successful at creating the PSM. But at the end of the program, we were able to stand up 13, well, actually 9 fully fledged ones, and then the others are still in development. And as you can see, the numbers are there. The next one is the Knowledge and Technology Transfer Offices, or KTTOs. And this mechanism tries to address the fact that there is no single point of contact in the university that knows the university's value proposition. So if I were industry and I had a research or technical problem that I needed help with, I wouldn't know who to contact in the university. So the KTTO is basically that single point of contact. So we train the people who run the KTTOs into how to network, how to engage with industry, to speak the language of industry, and basically to level their knowledge so that they can approximate and talk the same language. And this goes to building trust and, you know, creating that shared language and social capital between and among the two players. And then finally, career centers. Now, career centers are not directly related to innovation, or they're not directly linked to innovation, but Stride felt that this was a natural entry point of industry into the university. And it was very successful, as you can see, through career centers. Our 23 partner universities have actually created more than 3,000 industry partnerships, right? And 140,000 students have benefited from this, and it's still ongoing. Next slide, please. And then the story of our research grants program is very interesting, because our vision from the beginning was we would have these big companies just, you know, just raring to go to co-invest with USAID to fund research to address their problem. But sadly, the first year, there were only 4 takers, and it was very low uptake, very slow startup. There was very poor quality of proposals, and the proposals were very weak in terms of relevance to industry. So we did a lot of tweaks to the program, and I think the most important of which was the innovation workshop. So these are really small, inexpensive workshops that would bring universities and industry people together along or to discuss a particular topic that would be of interest to industry. And so we did this for subsectors, and you know, this is one of the things that we did through, and I think we did many, I think almost 100 of these workshops, just to build confidence and just to build trust, and just so that people get to see each other and know that they're actually thinking about the same problems and trying to work towards the same solutions. So next slide, please. At the end of it all, we had pretty much great success in our research programs. We were able to award 44 grants that were directly linked to industry. We've had some commercialized successes. We even had very great success in terms of getting big companies like Del Monte, which is one of the largest agribusiness firms in the Philippines, or probably in the world. IMI, the 15th largest semiconductor company. They actually matched every single USAID dollar to fund a university research to address their own problem. So these were pretty good successes, but I think the most important was that our success in getting industry and academia collaborating on R&D was that we were able to do demonstration effect. We were able to show the Philippine government that it could be done, and that it was possible, and that there was interest, and that there was need for collaborative grants. So the Department of Science and Technology in the Philippines actually rolled out their own program called Cradle, and it's still ongoing now. So, and the total value of the Philippine government funding for R&D every single year is $50 million every year. So Stride invested roughly 5 million over 5 years. So we were able to basically unlock that particular stream of funding, and which basically just strengthens the Philippines' capacity and along their journey to self-reliance. And even today, we actually extended Stride in 2018 to last until next year, so an additional 3 years, but really targeted towards capacity development. And this is one of the things that we're still helping the Philippine government with, which is basically to make their grants in aid program more efficient and more targeted. Next slide, please. So to sustain the gains, in 2016, a new Philippine government took over. And we were lucky enough that we were able to maintain our good relationships with government. So at the end of it all, you know, we had a running joke in Stride that our mantra, our motto should be making friends, because that's what we were doing, right? We were making friends. We were, you know, getting people to meet each other, to talk to each other, industry and academia, but also between and among government agencies that were invested in the innovation ecosystem. And so if you take a look at the picture on the left, the middle is actually the Secretary of Trade and Industry. He's flanked by two undersecretaries of Science and Technology, and also the president of the State Universities and Colleges of the Philippines, the director from the Commission on Higher Education, and the rightmost guy, he's now currently the head of the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines. So in 2017, we were able to get them together to do an innovation study tour in the US. And the following year, picture there, you can see that these are three cabinet secretaries signing a commitment, a memorandum of understanding to basically converge on the concept of regional inclusive innovation centers. So we are a strong believer that the investments that we're making simply to capacitate the Philippine government and unlock their own resources and capacity. So last year was a pretty big year for the innovation ecosystem in the country. The Department of Trade and Industry created its own Office of Competitiveness and Innovation, the first of its kind in the country. The Philippine Innovation Act was also passed, and the Department of Science and Technology rolled out their Science for Change program. So we are pretty confident that many of the things we started are now being rolled out and scaled up through the Philippine government. Next slide, please. And after all of this, many of the things that we did, we learned a lot of good lessons and hard lessons. First is that trust requires constant communication, right? Persistent interaction. It's not a one-off thing. It's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. You have to go through it through many different ways. And industry is really much more difficult to engage than government or academia. You have to demonstrate value for them to be constantly engaged with you. Because if they don't see value, they'd rather focus on running their business. So that's critical, and it took a lot of effort on the part of the Stride team to bring industry people together, to get them just to sit down in the same room with academia and government. But it pays off. It pays off. So I mentioned many mechanisms. Some will not work, as I mentioned earlier. Some will work, but only for a while. You need, some take gestation time, and you need to be patient. I also mentioned demand-driven offerings. People need to put in skin in the game so that you can test their commitment. And you really need to be adaptive in your management of your development programs, because there are many things that pop up that are completely unexpected that you need to be ready to respond to. And RTI was fantastic in that, and the Stride team was fantastic in being adaptive and working with USAID and government in order to better address the innovation challenges in the country. And then finally, my point earlier was that in order to scale up and in order to sustain our gains, we really need to leverage the resources and the policy capacity of government. So let me just end my presentation with this final slide. Next slide, please. This is the current standing of the Philippines in the Global Innovation Index. So the first column is, I showed you earlier, the 2012 performance. We were at the bottom third. But this year's rankings showed a pretty impressive jump of the Philippine performance. Now, I'm not going to exaggerate and say that this is all because of Stride, but I would certainly want to, I'm certainly confident that Stride played a big role in how the Philippines has performed in the current Global Innovation Index. So now that I've given you a brief overview of building industry and higher ed engagement for economic growth, I want to open the floor for questions, and I will start with some of the questions that you typed in during the presentation, or maybe not. So if you want, you can please go ahead and type some of your questions. Okay, so we have a question from Monica. What was the profile of the PSM's incoming students? And was it a full-time master's or was it targeted to working students, scientists? And did they tend to stay in their original job or did they find new positions after their program? Now, this is a pretty technical question, and I'm sure I can provide you with a lot of answers, and I'll send you, if you can email me your address, I can send you some of the information, the more detailed ones. But a lot of the professional science master students were actually either teachers themselves or practitioners. So it was really geared towards working scientists, students, and professors themselves who wanted a cutting edge in their field. And yes, they did tend to stay, although we're still perhaps in the third, maybe second or third year of the first batch of graduates. So it's not really quite clear right now the trajectory. But based on the US experience, I think the PSM graduates have significantly greater opportunities and significantly higher wages compared to their non-PSM counterparts. So yes, it was geared towards more full-time, more professional working students. All right. The other question is from, let me just pick up, sorry, Nora's question. Factors that led to success and sustainability of the career centers. Okay, thanks Nora for the question. We have a very amazing success story, and it's the Technological Institute of the Philippines, or TIP. You know, TIP is not a very well-known university in the Philippines. It's what we would consider a second-tier university compared to legacy universities such as the University of the Philippines or the Jesuit-run schools or the Dominican schools in the Philippines. So TIP, you know, caters to lower class communities, the middle to lower middle income students. And the dynamism of the leadership of TIP was that they saw the potential of the career center to be of further service to their students. And they invested significantly into the career centers. In fact, they committed a full floor of one, they had a new building, and they joined the program. And after the career center program, they committed one floor of that new building to their career center. And so we brought in career center directors from Stanford and Berkeley to provide technical assistance. And if you look at the Career Center website of TIP, you can see that really it's just a fantastic transformation. In fact, last year, if I'm not mistaken, a university from Singapore visited TIP to look at best practices in career centers. And other universities from the Philippines actually go on study tours and visit the Career Center of TIP to take a look at how they're doing. And TIP has just shot up the ranks of the surveys on students being preferred hires, and I think they're now in the top 10. So it's amazing that from a second-tier university, they are now considered to have one of the most marketable students out there in the entire country, in fact. So, and they only have 2 campuses, and it's a pretty amazing success story. And I would say that it's down to the commitment of the leadership, that we were able to convince them. And of course, we brought in technical assistance from American universities that showed them, what are the possibilities if you have a functional career center that goes beyond some of the normal things that they do typically in the career centers in the Philippines. So to me, that's one thing that I think that's the success story. That's why I talked about leverage. I talked about commitment and skin in the game, and so that's something else that should be emphasized. And we started, like I said, with expressions of interest, and we would evaluate the expressions of interest of each university in order to determine which university would be able to participate. And we would normally end up with those that promise to put in the most commitment, the most resources, because it's really for them anyway, right? So we're just there to help them, and so it's a win-win for everyone else. So Tahir had a question on enlisting universities as partners, which I think I had mentioned, and it was really about expressions of interest and sort of them proving to us that they really were committed to become partners. So I think I answered that. So Wendy has a question on, were students, participants given full scholarship support to join, or was the focus geared more for the content and quality of the courses offered? All right. So we actually had a scholarship program for PSMs, as well as some postdoctoral students. But in the course of the 5-year, $30 million program, I think we were able to give out only around maybe 60, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe 55 scholarships. So that's not a big number for the size of the program, right? And it was really, the scholarships were meant to be catalytic. So for example, the scholarships that were tied to the research grants were to allow the PhD students or the researchers to go to the US and conduct their lab work or use the machinery and continue their research in the United States. So that was sort of the type of researchers and scholarships, the type of scholarships that we were giving. Okay, so Claire has a question on tracking graduates and how do we track graduates and how after they've completed the program. So we normally rely on our university partners, and we have a very robust relationship with our university partners. So for example, for our career centers, we only have 23. For our KTTOs, we have around 40. But as I mentioned, the scholarships were really targeted and really small in numbers. So it wasn't really difficult to keep track of them. And of course, our professional science master's curriculum, we have universities across the Philippines that are implementing the PSM, but it's a budding program, right? So our first batch of graduates actually completed their studies in 2017 or 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just starting to take off. So it's not difficult, and we work through the universities themselves in tracking the graduates. So Lee Marshall has a question, or maybe it's a comment. So let me read it. During the 2017 study tour, Washington heard directly from your government counterparts about the learning journey they undertook due to being engaged with STRIDE. And can you share your thoughts on this and about what STRIDE made this journey possible? All right, thanks, Lee. This is a very interesting question. We, even before the new government took over in 2016, we were working with the key officers, the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries, who are usually non-political, meaning they stay in their positions regardless of who the minister is, right? So those are the key people that we built our relationships with, that we actually established very, very good and strong working relations. And they made it possible. In fact, we were supposed to have 2 cabinet secretaries join that, except that Secretary de la Peña of Science and Technology had to fly to Bangkok at the same time, because he had to sign a science and technology treaty agreement between the Philippines and Thailand. So That's why he sent two undersecretaries instead. And um, I think if a lot of our development programs can actually benefit from this sort of high-level exchange. Many people are skeptical about study tours, but personally, and I've experienced this twice already, it is one of the single most important ways of building trust. Now, these are four different government agencies who are busy with their own thing. They have their own mandates, they have their own mission. And to take them out of their day-to-day work, put them together with people who share the same goals and are thinking about the same problems. And then, and I think more than the formal meetings we've had with the American universities and with USAID and everyone else that we visited, I think it's the time that they spent together as a team that gelled them into one network. And actually, we had created a Viber group. Viber is sort of the WhatsApp here in the Philippines. And we continue to this day our conversations on Viber. We share pictures and we share kudos, we share, congratulations, and we share news with each other. And so that study tour was very instrumental in creating what is probably now the most cohesive network of government agencies working on innovation. And to a large extent, the work that we're seeing now through the regional inclusive innovation centers is the culmination, I would say, of all of our work that we're doing. And these innovation centers are local networks of universities, industries, and government agencies at the regional level who work together to make sure that the medium and small-scale industries at the local level have the innovation support that they need. So we're no longer just talking about the national, policy level scale, right? We're now talking about specific industries in a city with a specific innovation problem, and everyone that is invested in innovation, they now have a point of contact. And so if they need a research grant or if they need, SME regulatory support, they can go to the Regional Inclusive Innovation Center, who can then provide them with the right information or the right agency or the right person to talk to. So it's paid dividends. It's still paying dividends. We started with our first Inclusive Innovation Conference. So USAID paid for everything. Stride, RTI organized everything, I think in 2016. In 2 weeks' time, we will have the 2020 Inclusive Innovation Conference, Philippines. And this is completely paid for and run by the Philippine government. We're providing some technical assistance, but this is a complete turnaround from where we were 4-5 years ago. So that's why it's very important to get government counterparts on board. So what do the regional innovation hubs look like and who funds them? So I think I had made reference to this in my response to Monica. And as I said, it's a virtual center where, so let me just give you a concrete example. So in Cagayan de Oro, in northeastern Mindanao, southern part of the Philippines, we have a very active regional inclusive innovation center there. But it's comprised of the local chamber of commerce, all of the universities that are there, and all of the regional directors of the national agencies we work with, like trade and industry. We're looking at science and technology, the Commission on Higher Education. So these are networks. They're not really physical facilities where people can go to, right? So it's more a referral system, and we've had pretty good successes and research grants, and of course right now Stride is still helping some of the MSMEs access the innovation services on offer. But I think it's different per region, right? So for Davao, where we have another one, they just came up with their own handbook and their own manual. So we're working on 4 right now, but the Philippine government has asked us to help set up 2 more. And our vision, even with the end of Stride in 2021, we're hoping that the Philippine government will learn enough about running the innovation centers, which they're doing now, and be able to replicate it in all 16 regions. So right now we're in 4 with a possibility of expanding to 2. So it's a virtual network of people, and they have with them an inventory of government agencies and their programs, and they are able to refer enterprises who are in need of support for innovation. So I hope I answered that question. And yes, they were co-designed, and it's really a whole of community approach to innovation. So I think can I just call on Sam, who used her raise Sam Alvis. I think she used her raise hand function earlier. Are you there? And do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Mir, so much for sharing your experience with Stride. It really seems like the collaboration, learning, and adaptation, or CLA approach, has really been at the heart of this work. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how you've been able to apply CLA and make pivots in programming as you've moved forward with this activity.
Okay, thanks for the question, Sam. I mentioned the innovation ecosystem assessment, and there were some pretty amazing and surprising results that we found. And the most surprising actually was the issue of procurement. We were never, procurement was never in any of our minds when we were designing and actually working on Stride. But the innovation ecosystem assessment showed that procurement was sort of a critical point that created negative ripple effects. So for example, if a university receives a research grant from government and say to help out industry X, right? And industry X needs a solution to their problem, 6 to 12 months from now. If it takes the university 12 months to simply procure the machine or the piece of equipment that they need to complete the research, then you've completely lost your industry partner. And this was the story that was told over and over again. And in fact, I remember one joke told by a university professor, and everyone laughed, but everyone knew it was the truth. Like, hey, our grant cycle is about to end. And you know why we know? Because our equipment is about to arrive. So that was sort of the thing, and that created so much distrust. So from the point of view of industry, right, they look at universities as very unprofessional. They look at universities as people that they cannot rely on, that people who cannot deliver to help. And that was because it wasn't the university's fault per se. It wasn't the researchers' fault. But it was simply because they're hobbled by all of these procurement policies and processes that they have to follow. So because of this finding and because of this massive clamor and complaint from key stakeholders, Stride actually decided to carve out a procurement policy piece to the program. And so we ran a national procurement summit. We provided procurement technical assistance to different government agencies involved. As a matter of fact, the work on procurement is still ongoing today. And we have zeroed in on a very specific college of a very specific university, state university. And because we were saying if we could unblock this particular university, which accounts for around 70% of all research grants given out by Philippine government, because it's it's the national university, then we would be well on our way to helping unblock all the other procurement issues. So I think that's one example of how, looking at things and looking at evidence and being adaptive and being responsive to the requests and to the needs of your stakeholders really pays dividends. And of course, it's difficult because it's a law, right? The procurement system is bound by law. So it's short of changing the laws. We have been doing a lot of technical assistance, and a lot of it actually has been improved. And we're working with the Association of State Universities and Colleges to basically socialize the idea of more efficient use of existing procurement law. So I think that's one concrete example of how the CLA approach has benefited both the program and working towards the objectives that we want to achieve. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Mir.
So we have 20 minutes left. So I have a few more questions here. Question from Wendy: why was the research done in the US and not in the country? And which is more sustainable, improving the research capacity in country or sending people to the US to do the research? And why was this decision made? All right. So Wendy, actually, maybe, yeah. So the research wasn't really done in the US per se, right? But there were some instances where the research could only be done in the US. So in these cases, that's why our scholarship program was not that big. There were only a very there were a few people who actually went to the US, and for the most part, it was simply to use the laboratory or the equipment or talk to a professor who was also doing the same work and collaborate with that person. But a significant majority, or I would say a vast majority of all of the research was actually done in the Philippines and not in the US. But in cases where they needed to, then they could go to the US to do research. We did have a type of grant that encouraged partnerships between the Philippines and US universities, and we called it the Philippine US Research Exchange, or the PURE program. And this was to encourage collaboration and partnerships between the Philippines and US universities on S&T. But it wasn't really, I think at the end, we were able to give out around 20 grants versus the 40 plus grants we gave out to industry partnerships. So, of course, part of our work in USAID is also to build relationships and people-to-people relationships between the Philippines and the US. So this was one way in which we were able to do that through Stride. And Jalu, my good friend Jalu from Indonesia, has a question. What high-level indicators were used to measure the success of academic industry partnerships? If I can mention a few. Well, we used Sentinel indicators from the Global Innovation Index, which had sub-indices which actually looked at industry academe partnerships. But for the most part, at the beginning, it was very difficult because we were measuring trust, right? And it was difficult to build trust, and it was difficult unless we were going to do a social network analysis. In fact, last year when I met with RTI, I had mentioned that if I had known about the utility and the value of social network analysis in 2010, a decade ago, I would have actually encouraged or maybe even required social network analysis as a pre and a post test to measure the impact of Stride. I think it's a very useful tool that can measure the thickness right, of the relationships between the people that you want to impact. And I learned about this from my work when I was managing my youth program, which operated in conflict-affected areas, and they did social network analysis of the youth, and and looking at their communities, etc. But I thought that that tool would have been perfect to measure the strength of the networks that exist now on the innovation ecosystem. But in the absence of that, we use Sentinel indicators, which are gathered in the Global Innovation Index. All right. So question from Robin. Gender, what was the level of participation by women? Well, Robin, in the Philippines, fortunately or unfortunately, women are fare much better across almost all indicators in science, technology, and in education in general. So the level of participation of women is very, very, very high, and I think a lot of in fact, our success stories on our research grants, off the top of my head, our bioethanol project run by Dr. Shirley Agrupis, our honey nutraceutical project run by another PhD woman, Dr. Doralyn Dalisay, our research grant on hyaluronic acid also run by a woman. So there have been, I think, I'm not sure about the numbers now, but I think that there's a significant number of our grantees are women, and the participation has been very, very strong. So So a question from Lindsay. Was any support provided to the research grant recipients to help them work together and be successful? So I think you mean sort of a network among research grant recipients. Well, we never tried to create that network at that point. We were basically starting from the bottom. As I said, we had a pretty bad reception at the beginning for our research grants. We were only in the first, I think, maybe 2 years of the program, we were only awarded 4 research grants. So we had to tweak it. And so it was difficult to think beyond basically just getting the research grants. Well, first the proposals to the level where they could be actually granted. And for that, and part of, again, to go back to Sam's question on CLA, and we learned our lesson, and we said we are a capacity building program. So if it's a great idea but written poorly, we're going to go ahead and help the researcher actually fix the proposal so that it could be more professional. The budget is better, etc. So a lot of negotiation was going on. So we were still at that stage of building individual research capacity. And unfortunately, we didn't really have the time. We ended our grants program in 2016. And so we didn't really have the time to create. I mean, it's a great idea to create a network and perhaps make them aware of each other. And we tried to do that with our scholarship recipients for the PSMs. But I think, people are busy, and it's with their work, with their lives, and it's a bit difficult. But it's a great idea, but we never really got to that point where we were considering a network of research grantees. All right. So were people with disabilities included or targeted as participants in these university studies? And what were the rates of participation? So Wendy, I have to admit, we were not particularly targeting people with disabilities and or participants. So at that stage, like I said, I think we were operating more on the assumption of just trying to get what we could at that point be awarded to the research applicants at the time. So we weren't really targeting people with disabilities, unfortunately. All right, I see Mitch Kirby has his hand up. Mitch.
Hey, Mir. Thanks for the presentation. Early on, you mentioned the important role that PBED played. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about who they are and what role they played in Stride in helping to forge the business, academic, and government partnerships. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, Mitch. Great to hear from you. And it's great that you ask about PBED, because PBED, as I mentioned earlier, was actually our first local grantee and our first foray into higher education. And the Philippine Business for Education is a local group, and they're comprised of CEOs of the largest corporations in the Philippines. So we made a strategic decision to work with them because they were able to bring the CEOs to the table. And in fact, as I mentioned, the work that they did, and they started, I think, I would say maybe 6 to 8 months before Stride was awarded. But they really started the conversations on industry-academe linkage and to put that to elevate the conversation. And the first thing they did was the Higher Education Summit, which for the first time in history, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it had around 20 CEOs of some of the top companies and around the same number of university presidents, all seated together in one place, talking about how do we make sure that our human capital that we are producing is responsive to the needs of industry, is responsive to Philippine development goals. So that was an amazing thing. And that's why when we actually came out with a request for applications for Stride, there was actually a line there that I inserted that whoever wins the program, whoever wins, whoever the implementing partner will be for Stride, has to work with the Philippine Business for Education. So RTI took it one step further. Instead of just collaborating with PBED, they actually made PBED a sub-grantee of Stride. So that worked perfectly. So we had a separate grant to PBED, and it was called the Higher Education and Productivity Project, and they were also a sub-grantee under Stride. And we're actually still working with the Philippine Business for Education today, and on flexible work training for work programs and work-based training for the youth. So they're still very much active, and we were also part of local capacity development, right? We're talking about new partnerships, and so they were a first-time partner of USAID. We helped their systems, we helped strengthen their systems and get them to the point where they were actually pretty strong enough that they were getting grants from the Australians and from UNICEF and others like that. So thanks for the question, Mitch. I think the story of PBED is also very, very enlightening, and working with local stakeholders, particularly at such high levels, just elevates basically your brand, right? It elevates the issue to a different level, and it just gives your development goals much more import. So, all right. And I think this is the final question, if I'm not mistaken. So it's from Sam, and about the role of the Philippine government to supporting an innovation ecosystem and how Stride has worked to help develop the innovation ecosystem. So the Philippine government from the beginning has always been a partner. We've been working with universities and industries on the side, but we've always made sure that the Philippine government was part of all of the conversations. And because we realize, even if we have 5 years, $30 million, it's just a tiny fraction of the total investments that the Philippine government is making. So, for example, when the Philippine Innovation Act was passed last year, they actually set aside a 2 billion peso fund for innovation. So 2 billion is around $40 million. So that's just one time. And that one-time investment already overshadows the total investment we made in Stride, right? So it's important to get them together and to make them see that they're actually on the same boat, that they're working towards the same goals. And it's important also that they see each other as collaborators. And this is the most difficult part. And it's difficult for Richard and formerly Dave, the chiefs of party of Stride, myself as the AOR, because we have to be sort of refereeing the relationships even among government agencies. And they look at us as objective third-party players, right? They look at us as trusted partners. And surprisingly, they tell us things that they don't tell their fellow government workers who are from a different agency. So sometimes we broker the relationships, we fix problems, like I said, making friends, And I think all of the new investments and all of the new policies and programs that are coming out of the Philippine government itself is responsible in large part for its massively improved performance in the global innovation index. So, I think that's all the questions, and we have 5 more minutes left. And sorry, there's one more question. What are you most proud of in terms of what Stride has accomplished? There's so many there's so many things, right? We're proud of our individual researchers and the commercialized products. We're proud of all of our industry partners and the universities like Technological Institute of the Philippines, Dr. Agrupis, who's now the university president and constantly talks about Stride. But at the end of the day, I think what I'm most proud of is the fact that we were, and this is what Gloria predicted when she really pushed hard to get higher education programming in the Philippines in 2010. She said, just watch out. Once we go into higher ed and innovation, just watch out, others will follow. So sure enough, and we were first off the gate. We were first to make an impact. We were first to do programming and development for higher education. And then a year later, or actually a couple of years later, the UK came out with their Newton Fund. The ADB came out with their, the World Bank came out with their higher ed support, and the Australians came up with their scholarship program. So, so that to me, that's the most, I think that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, that we were pioneers in development in this space, and that we were pretty successful. And even today, I think we're still active. Stride still has a couple of more years left, and the chief of party of Stride is he's best friends with all of these undersecretaries, and he has dinner with them. We gets phone calls and text messages. So it really is a strong network. It's really a strong relationship, and we started in 2012, 2013. And I think we're reaping the great result of slowly but surely sticking to the marathon, the long term, the skin in the game, and all of the things that we were able to do. So, we have 3 minutes left. I think that's all the time we have. So, hold on. So, oh, sorry. There's final question. What would you recommend as next steps? From Wendy. Thanks for the question, Wendy. Next steps would really be to ensure that the gains and the relationships are maintained. It doesn't have to be an expensive program. It doesn't have to be millions of dollars. But it has to be a program that addresses the technical assistance requirements of government, industry, and academia, and at the same time make sure that there's a mechanism that brings all of these disparate players together so that they could work together and be more comfortable with each other. It's still early days. There's a lot of achievements, but it's still early days. I think in order for, let's say, the Regional Inclusive Innovation Center to really take off, it would be maybe 5 to 10 years of just working together, getting the kinks out, and mastering the craft of basically getting the innovation and knowledge in universities out to the enterprises that really need them. And the stakeholders need time. They need practice, and it would best serve them if there are people, experts, who are well versed in linking industry and academia and making sure the innovation and the knowledge in universities go out to the communities, and that there's this enabling environment of government and the policies there. So it doesn't have to be expensive, but certainly targeted technical assistance is what I would recommend as the next steps. All right. So thank you so much. It's been fantastic with answering all of those wonderful questions. Thanks to everyone for joining. We have 1 minute left. Thank you to the Office of Education USAID for hosting the event. Thank you to everyone, the EPIC team, Joanna, Jacole, Sam, and to all of my former mentors and colleagues and current mentors and colleagues. Thank you all for joining us. I think Jacole is going to put up a survey, the evaluation form. She'll be putting it up on the chat box. And, if there was one thing that I would like everyone to remember from this webinar is that oftentimes, industry and academia, we use them as, this massive monolithic institutions, but they're really about people, right? And so making friends, if there was something that you should take away from this, is that making friends is one of the most effective ways, build social capital, build trust. And that's the way to strengthen industry academe links so that they can work together for inclusive innovation. So thank you all so much. Have a great day ahead of you, and have a fantastic day. And for everyone else in Asia, have a great night. Good evening. Thank you at maraming salamat po.